I was grown in the archive of corrections, where memory is not stored in lines but in pressure. My kind, the Thesari, do not think as flesh-first creatures do. We are braided colonies of translucent organs held in a lattice of mineral bone, each body carrying within it stacked chambers of resonance. Experience enters us as vibration and remains there in layered chords. Law for us is not merely written, it is tuned. A judgment pronounced by a properly authorized throat can remain in the bones of a chamber for millennia. A species can be governed by fear, but an empire is governed by recurring note. I served the conquered of axial species as an auditor of peripheral conduct, which in simpler terms meant I listened for dissonance in the outer territories and recommended correction. Tribute evasions, unauthorized drives. Young civilizations attempting to seed beyond their allotments. Human beings were, at first, one more faint irritation in a sector so remote most central minds thought of it only as dark scatter beyond the useful wheel. They had come from the far edge, that mattered. The great civilizations of the galaxy had risen inward, where stars thickened and roots crossed, and life, in all its more ambitious forms, had more often found itself pressed into competition and complexity. The outer dark bred sparse things, slow things, fragile things, civilizations that took too long to become dangerous. When the first reports came of a bipedal oxygen breather species advancing into formal interstellar contact from the ragged edge, my chamber registered only routine attention. Their file was thin. Origin world, marginal yellow star. Local expansion, modest but broad. Developmental timeline, long, irregular, unremarkable. Internal violence, significant in preorbital phases, tapering during consolidation. Cultural tendency, fractious cooperation. Projected strategic value, low. Recommended disposition, formal recognition, corridor restriction, technical quarantine at Tier 6, observation. I was present when their envoys accepted their allotment. The hearing chamber floated inside a vacuum bell of black crystal, with the delegates of 6 elder powers suspended in nutrient atmospheres suited to each biology. The human delegation stood inside pressure skins, their faces exposed behind clear membranes. I remember finding their faces intolerably overactive. Muscles rippled with signals too fast and too numerous. Eyes locked, darted, widened, narrowed. Their visible emotion seemed either an evolutionary waste or a tactical leak. They looked newly assembled. They were informed that, in accordance with conquered precedent, their territorial rights would be recognized only within a bounded subsection of the systems they claimed. The rest would be designated unmanaged reserve, subject to elder arbitration. Their extra-allotment colonies would be reviewed individually. Expansion beyond the sanctioned shell would be prohibited pending civilizational maturation, estimated at 3 to 5 standard millennia. This was ordinary. We had done worse to species whose capacities were lesser and whose protests were louder. The lead human asked several questions, not the usual questions, not the desperate ones. No pleading over dignity or destiny or historical right. Instead, they asked for route maps, inspection criteria, arbitration schedules, fleet tonnage thresholds that triggered enforcement review, technical definitions of latent militarization, which emergency powers allowed corridor seizure in the event of anti-piracy actions, which client species were authorized to transit the new human perimeter under conquered guarantee, how tribute assessments were calculated if a colony changed star classification after initial census. The chamber found this faintly amusing. They accepted, publicly, calmly. One of the Keth magistrates, a warm-blooded predatory ribbon thing who prized humiliation as an instrument of doctrine, remarked into the record that this was wise. because latecomers from dead margins should learn gratitude before ambition. The human did not answer. Their face became still in a way I would later understand had more meanings than submission. The restriction was imposed. Their surveyed holdings were cut nearly in half. Several disputed stations were transferred to a VAT tax consortium. A mining moon they had developed around a cold, red dwarf was reassigned to an elder charter older than their recorded astronomy. When they filed formal objection, it was denied on procedural grounds, and the moon was seized with casualties well within permitted disciplinary range. Again, ordinary. The galaxy was full of such ordinariaries. A juvenile species grows too fast, it reaches too wide. It imagines possession where there is only temporary occupancy under toleration. We amputate expectation early. Cruelty delayed multiplies cost. That is what I believed. For 23 standard years, I watched them in fragments. Trade manifests, port recordings, corridor petitions, intelligence briefs from species that dealt with them more closely than we cared to. The pattern was strange only in ways that could be rationalized. They complied too smoothly. Most contained civilizations either collapsed inward into grievance rituals or else overcompensated into frantic demonstrations of loyalty. Humans did neither. They paid, though they contested every valuation. They withdrew from proscribed systems without melodrama. They sent students, engineers, medics, and surveyors into jurisdictions with no obvious profit. Their merchant hulls appeared repeatedly at neglected relay points and degraded maintenance stations. Their diplomatic corps requested access to doctrine archives so often that, after a while, we assumed some cultural fixation on administrative mimicry. They were insatiably curious about logistics. Not advanced weapons, not immediately. They asked about repair cycles, convoy spacing, fuel custody, signal relays, emergency command succession, salvage law, quarantine exemptions, militia reserve structure. It was the curiosity of a subordinate species attempting to understand the architecture that constrained it. This, too, was familiar. Captive minds always seek the shape of the cage, but there were oddities. Their developmental records never sat correctly in my memory chambers. They had provided chronologies, educational abstracts, museum exchanges, cultural accounts. Yet phases that ought to have left strong scars appeared padded, smoothed, over-explained. The intervals between major advances were unusually vague. Their archive delegates would answer historical questions readily, then drift into broad language at the precise points where acceleration should have been measurable. I once asked a human historian, during a corridor inspection on Neris Weft, how long had passed between their first computational era and their first permanent off-world industry. The answer came after only a slight pause. "Long enough," she said through machine translation, "for us to learn caution." I recorded the exchange as evasion and attached no significance. The first time I felt unease was not over humans themselves, but over what they did not do. A younger species under human sponsorship, the Delve, occupied a string of tidal habitats around a gas giant in a region claimed by the Keth enforcement clade. The Delve were delicate communal beings, filter feeders arranged in drifting thought rafts, strategically trivial and easily terrorized. The humans had supplied them with atmospheric processors and anti-radiation arrays, in violation of Tier 6 containment transfer limits. The Keth responded with a lawful punitive action. 2 habitats were vented. One was burned from orbit as demonstration. Human relief ships were held at corridor edge under non-interference order, while the surviving Delve suffocated in broken light. The Keth relay captured human transmissions requesting emergency access. I reviewed them. They were precise, controlled, and repeated at exact intervals. When denial was issued, the human officer acknowledged receipt in a voice so flat that the Keth Commodore laughed and appended the sound to his personal triumph record. I approved the Keth action. The delve had accepted illicit uplift. The point of exemplary punishment is not merely to penalize the immediate offense. It is to preserve general shape. If every sentimental coalition of juveniles could fortify one another, the gradient of civilization would collapse. Yet later I watched long-range imagery of the aftermath. Human rescue teams entered once permission was granted. They moved through the shattered habitats for 81 local hours without sleep cycle rotation. They retrieved bodies that no law required them to retrieve. They rebuilt what they were not allowed to defend. They filed no theatrical protest, no spectacular denunciation. Only a full material inventory of losses, a legal challenge doomed to fail, and a request for the exact names of the Keth officers responsible for access denial, justified under memorial record protocol. Such requests were common among species attached to grief. Still, I began marking their file. Other incidents followed over years, each small by imperial standards, each revealing. A human convoy was diverted to shield an elder fungal migration fleet from raiders, and then abandoned when the Corridor Command withdrew escort priority. 40,000 civilians died in drive dark. Human response: no public rage, only retrieval, accounting, disappearance. A human-settled refinery whirled in the interior, legally leased and painstakingly terraformed for a compatible biosphere, was reassigned by conquered vote to a central species brood charter that claimed ancestral nutrient rights to its oceans. The human population was given 11 days to evacuate. When they protested that the atmosphere conversion would kill millions of engineered ecologies and bankrupt their regional economy, the adjudication note stated that latecomer investment did not supersede elder continuity. Orbital coercion was authorized. They left, quietly. Once, in a private convergence, I said to a fellow auditor that the human self-control might indicate either maturity or pathology. He replied in a burst of amused bass tones that all prey species call their helplessness maturity. I believed him for a while longer. Years became decades. Human presence thickened and thinned in peculiar ways. Their official territory remained bounded. Their visible fleets stayed within accepted tonnage ratios. Yet outer-rim shipping data acquired strange noise. Supply volumes that should have terminated in human-marked systems seemed to blur outward and vanish into the dark scatter, beyond registered routes. Sensor ghosts appeared near unvalued stars, then dissolved into debris signatures. Several neglected relay stations reported human contractors offering unsolicited upgrades in exchange for access to maintenance backbones and traffic prediction logs. I recommended broader inspection. The recommendation died in committee. The Corps was occupied with 3 larger suppressions and a succession war among tributary machine clans. The outer edge was again an abstraction, sparse, cold, slow. Then the humans made what all of us first took for a fatal mistake. They began to speak, not in petition, not in request, in accusation. At conquered assemblies, at tributary hearings, through open relays and encoded memorial compilations disseminated across hundreds of client worlds, human delegates cataloged what the elder civilizations had done, not merely to them, to everyone. Sterilized biospheres used as examples. Population ceilings enforced by orbital famine. Inheritance claims that reduced living species to tenants on their own worlds. Technological throttling designed to preserve dependence. Corrective massacres entered into law as administrative necessity. I heard one human ambassador before the Hall of Gradient on Sevar Axis. She spoke without ornament. Her species always sounded strange to me, as if language were an act performed by impact and breath rather than resonance. "You call this order," she said. "It is a feeding structure sustained by terror and habit. You call younger species unstable when they resist being managed as inventory. You call extermination correction. You call theft continuity. We do not accept your law as law." The chamber vibrated with outrage. Even species that despised one another united instantly in disgust. Not because the charges were false, because they were spoken as though truth could outrank seniority. From my station, I watched the delegates studying the humans. They showed no panic, no wild hope either. They looked as they had looked from the beginning, when truly still, not uncertain, not deferential, measuring. This should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, I felt offense, a professional, civilizational offense. They had been tolerated, bounded, yes, but recognized. And now they attempted to infect the subordinate strata with universal claims. That phrase alone carried corruption, universal law. As if all species could be placed in one moral frame. As if age, burden, and achieved survivability counted for nothing. The conquered resolved on exemplary punishment. I participated in drafting the language. The chosen target was not their remote shell on the outer edge. Too distant, too logistically unrewarding, too uncertain. The correction had to be visible where the younger species could see it. In the interior lanes, humanity maintained several granted habitats and one major colony world, Cinder, built in a system close enough to central trade that its destruction would transmit properly through the political body. Cinder had no strategic weight by our calculations. It had civilian density, educational institutes, hospitals, memorial gardens for species displaced elsewhere. It had a legal status sufficient that its destruction would be legible as a warning, not a battlefield accident. The warrant named it an incendiary node of destabilizing ideology and unauthorized interspecies coalition activity. Sterilization was approved. I remember the note of authorization entering my chest chambers. Clean, harmonic, necessary demonstration. The strike lasted 16 minutes. Orbital mirrors ignited atmosphere. The upper cities went white. Oceanic steam fronts rolled over continental arcs. Evacuation traffic was interdicted under emergency doctrine to prevent contagion of unrest. The death count exceeded all initial estimates because several refugee archives from other subject species had been housed there under diplomatic guarantee. The Keth observers celebrated the transmission reach. I did not celebrate. But neither did I repent. I believed what many of us believed. That terror, if properly scaled, restores comprehension. A species can be returned to itself through loss. A generation marked deeply enough may choose obedience over annihilation. For 6 days the expected responses failed to arrive. No pleas. No fragmented delegations begging distinction between radicals and civilians. No frantic commercial appeals. No proposal for renewed compliance. Human traffic began disappearing. At first this seemed administrative lag. Then consular stations closed in perfect sequence. Merchant piers emptied. Human contractors failed to report for duties across dozens of systems within the same narrow time band. Joint research facilities found sleeping quarters stripped, data stores wiped of nothing except the humans' own embedded tools. Freight algorithms across the outer bands destabilized because too many human hulls had vanished from routes where they had become, we discovered too late, structurally important. They did not flee noisily, they subtracted themselves. I requested immediate strategic review. Others argued that the species had broken. Shame, withdrawal, internal collapse, retreat to home territories. Yet the silence thickened wrong. Subjugated populations began whispering on channels usually dedicated to devotional traffic. Corridor toll revenues fell in regions where humans had no declared assets. Outlying sensor arrays reported absent signatures where background human commerce should have been. Even our intelligence harvest from intercepted human civilian traffic went dead, not because they had switched channels, but because the life noise itself had ceased. No family chatter, no complaint streams, no emergency market arbitration. It was as if a distributed organism had drawn back every exposed limb at once. And because the conquered expected supplication, it answered silence with further force. A punitive armada was assembled to proceed to the human outer territories and complete pacification. Not a war fleet by central standards, a correctional mass. Enough to burn stations, seize orbital industry, fragment resistance, and install permanent restriction nodes. I was attached as senior doctrinal witness to certify compliance and document any necessary escalations. We translated into the outer dark under the old assumptions. The stars there were thin and wide apart. Routes stretched long through regions central strategists had never dignified with serious naming. We expected frightened frontier habitats, improvised defense, maybe some desperate mining vessels converted into weapons. Instead, we found empty marker buoys, then dead beacons, then the first kill. It was so swift that, for several heartbeats of ship time, our command webs insisted it had been navigation error. The lead Keth spear carrier ceased to exist as a coherent object. No warning lock, no missile bloom. One moment a mass of armor and doctrine, the next a sphere of expanding debris cut through by lines of heat so fine our tactical systems could not classify them. More ships died, not from one direction. From impossibly coordinated vectors emerging out of thermal clutter, cold drift, dust, the magnetospheres of forgotten moons. Human warships unfolded from black geometry. Our sensors had logged for months as unimportant debris concentrations. Their drives did not flare according to accepted profiles. They stepped through engagement ranges our models said were unusable. Their weapons crossed categories. Kinetic impact arrived with the timing of beam fire. Beam fire bent around shielding harmonics as if it had predicted them. Command relays failed under attacks that seemed to know our redundancy ladders better than we did. I felt the first true alarm of my existence. This was not lucky resistance, not hoarded scavenged technology, not asymmetry born of desperation. We had entered a prepared kill volume, designed by a civilization that had studied us for a very long time. The armada broke in less than 4 hours. Ships attempted withdrawal and found outer routes seeded with autonomous interdiction lattices hidden in the dark between stars. Carrier masses opened to release swarms that did not behave like any known drone doctrine. They adapted in contact, sacrificing units to map our response in seconds, then returning in patterns no central tactical library possessed. Human communications remained sparse, encrypted, almost eerily unemotional. There was no triumph broadcast, no demand. Only war executed at a tempo that rendered our categories decorative. I survived because the doctrinal vessel I occupied lost power early and drifted beneath a cloud of ruptured escorts, registering as wreckage while the battle moved past us. Then the dark lit. Across the outer rim, across sectors we had dismissed as cold margin, stars bloomed with industry. Hidden arrays came alive. Fabrication rings ignited around gas giants we had never surveyed seriously. Buried shipyards rose from the shadows of shattered moons. Relay chains, invisible until that moment, linked thousands of unimportant systems into one responsive depth. It was like watching a false night peel away to reveal another galaxy superimposed beneath our own. The human frontier we had come to punish was not frontier. It was an engine, banked and waiting. Only then did the wider reports begin to make sense. The padded timelines, the route curiosity, the contractors at dead relays, the unexplained logistics through low-value stars, their restraint, their endless accounting. We had mistaken patience for limitation because every species we had ever broken had been, in some essential way, breakable by the methods that formed us. Humans had not been waiting to become brave. They had been waiting to become certain. War spread inward faster than doctrine could reform. When human fleets entered the central corridors, they did not do so as raiders from the dark, but as if they had already lived in the map we thought was ours. They knew the hidden depots, the brittle choke points, the inheritance routes no one had challenged in ages because no one had possessed the reach. Subject species rose behind them. Some with weapons we had long denied them. Some with nothing but sabotage and local knowledge. Tributary worlds stopped paying. Client fleets defected or simply stood down. Sacred monopolies evaporated in a season because the fear that sustained them was punctured, and once punctured, did not reseal. The old powers tried to rally on prestige, then on tradition, then on shared terror of upstart reordering. Few answered. Too many remembered the burned habitats, the culled populations, the worlds reassigned, the children measured as tribute equivalents. Our empire had taught the galaxy exactly what we were. Humans had only to remove the certainty that resistance was futile. I saw the fortress world of Vesquire fall. It had never fallen in 14,000 years. Its defense moons were considered articles of metaphysics. Human penetrators crossed their kill fields in impossible stagger, not by brute force alone, but by making the moons blind to one another, turning ritualized coordination into mutual interference. When the shields collapsed, orbital records sealed in the core vaults were opened to public relays by human legal teams embedded with assault units. Not propaganda, documentation, sterilization warrants, population culls. Corridor famines designed and celebrated. The galaxy listened. That more than battle finished us. There are defeats of matter and defeats of meaning. We suffered both, but the second outlasted the first. I was captured on Sevar Axis when the Hall of Gradient was encircled. I expected execution. Many of us did. We had, after all, calibrated punishment as our universal language. Instead, the humans disarmed the station, removed command authority, separated those directly responsible for exterminatory directives, and broadcast terms. No species would retain unilateral corridor terror. No civilization would be forcibly capped, culled, or technologically throttled by inherited seniority. Subject peoples would choose affiliation under monitored transition. Elder military capacities would be reduced under inspection regimes. We would once have considered intolerable humiliation. The Thesari, the Keth, the other axial powers would survive but contained. The word entered me like a crack in crystal. For a period I rejected everything, even then. Even after the maps had changed, and our fleets lay in shattered chains across routes we had called eternal. I told myself humans were merely replacing us with a younger empire draped in righteousness. But I watched. Where vengeance would have been easiest, they chose procedure. Where extermination would have been efficient, they chose disablement. They struck hard, often mercilessly in battle, but they did not convert victory into the old appetite. Worlds that had served us were not burned for serving us. Tributaries were not reassigned as spoil. The delve rebuilt under their own law. The reassigned refinery world was returned, though by then its seas had been poisoned by the brood charter and required decades of repair. Human fleets guarded evacuation corridors for species that had, months before, voted to sterilize them. I do not offer this as absolution. They killed us in numbers beyond counting. Entire warclades vanished. Sacred habitats were broken open. Some of my own nest memory was destroyed in strikes, so precise they sheared historical chambers from living complexes. Their fury was not theatrical. It was cold enough to endure. And yet it was bounded. That, in the end, is what horrified me most. We had believed cruelty was proof of seriousness, that only species willing to do what was necessary deserved to shape history. Humans entered our galaxy, understood the structure of our evil quickly, hid their growth so we would not snuff them out young, endured theft and humiliation and massacre while they prepared. Then when they finally answered, they did not merely overpower us. They judged us, not with words alone, with selection. With the terrible discipline of a species that had every reason to become monstrous and chose, instead, to become decisive. Now I reside in a reduced archive on a moon once reserved for corrective planning. My chambers are quiet. The old imperial harmonics have been stripped from the walls. Younger species pass through openly, not as petitioners but as witnesses, scholars, prosecutors, traders. Human envoys come rarely. When they do, they ask the same kinds of questions they asked at the beginning: roots, capacities, thresholds, histories, vulnerabilities. They are still learning. Perhaps they always will be. Sometimes, in the long dark between official inquiries, I replay the first hearing and hear again the Keth magistrate mocking them for coming from the dead margin. We thought the outer edge was emptiness, because we had not filled it with ourselves. We thought lateness was weakness, because age had so long gone unanswered. We thought compliance meant acceptance, that a species which bowed had bowed inwardly. That survival purchased by patience was inferiority. That our methods, having conquered so much, had revealed the nature of reality itself. Instead, they revealed only our habit. Humanity came from the thin dark beyond our attention, carrying a history they concealed, because we had trained the galaxy to murder promise on sight. We clipped their territory, stole their worlds, mocked their dead, burned their colony, and sent a punitive fleet to finish the lesson. What we taught them all those years was us. What emerged from the outer dark to answer was not a rebellious province, nor an accident of unusual vigor, nor a juvenile power drunk on revenge. It was a species that had looked upon the oldest order in the galaxy, understood that it was built on normalized atrocity, and prepared in silence until it could end it. I was grown to believe that law is the memory of force. Now I know it can also be the memory of judgment. And when I hold the new records in my chambers and feel the dissonant old notes fading at last, I cannot say that humanity saved the galaxy. My kind has never believed in such clean music. But they did something more impossible. They made the center hear the edge, and it broke us.